Eleanor was a widow who'd convinced herself that romantic love belonged to her past, that museums on Tuesday afternoons were meant to be enjoyed alone, that contentment was the same thing as happiness. Until the day she met Robert in front of an Impressionist painting, and a simple conversation about art became the beginning of something that would challenge everything she believed about love and timing, and whether it was ever too late to feel passion that takes your breath away. I invite you to subscribe to our channel, and please share in the comments where you're listening from today. I love knowing where our stories travel. Eleanor Walsh was 67 years old when she decided that museums on Tuesday afternoons were her favorite form of solitude. Not the crowded weekend exhibitions when families with strollers navigated the galleries and teenagers posed for photos in front of famous paintings, but the quiet weekday hours when the Portland Art Museum felt almost private, when footsteps echoed on marble floors, and you could stand before a painting for as long as you wanted, without feeling like you were blocking someone's view. She'd been a widow for 3 years, though widow felt like too formal a word for what she was. Simply alone after 42 years of marriage to Richard, a good man who died quietly in his sleep from a heart attack that gave no warning. No chance for goodbye. Just presence one night and absence the next morning. The grief had been profound, but not devastating, which made Eleanor feel guilty in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd loved Richard genuinely, had built a good life with him, raised 2 children who were now adults with their own families. But there had always been something restrained about their love, something comfortable rather than consuming, partnership rather than passion. On this particular Tuesday in October, Portland's autumn rain created a gentle percussion against the museum's tall windows, and Eleanor stood before a painting she'd seen dozens of times before, a French Impressionist piece depicting lovers in a garden, all soft edges and romantic light. She was contemplating the way the artist had captured intimacy through proximity and gaze rather than touch when she heard a voice beside her, low and thoughtful, speaking as if to himself rather than to her. The voice belonged to a man who appeared to be around her age, perhaps a few years older, with silver hair that suggested he'd once been dark-haired, and a face that carried the kind of character that only decades of living could create. He wore casual but elegant clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater under a wool coat still damp from rain, and he was looking at the painting with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine appreciation rather than polite museum-going. He was commenting on the painting's composition, on how the artist had used light to create emotional rather than just visual impact, and Eleanor found herself responding before she'd decided to speak, pointing out details she'd noticed about the way the figures leaned toward each other, creating intimacy through body language that was subtle but unmistakable. And just like that, without introduction or deliberate initiation, they were having a conversation, 2 strangers discussing art with the kind of engagement that suggested they were both starved for this specific kind of intellectual connection. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd retired 6 months ago after a career in architecture, had moved to Portland from Seattle to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren, and was still adjusting to having more time than purpose, more freedom than structure. He'd lost his wife 4 years ago to cancer that had taken 2 years to kill her, and the way he said it, matter of fact but with underlying grief that time had softened, but not erased, made Eleanor understand that his loss had been different from hers, more prolonged, more witnessed. Grief earned through watching someone you love slowly disappear. They walked through the museum together, without discussing whether they were walking together, moving from gallery to gallery, their conversation flowing with the ease of people who'd known each other for years rather than minutes. Robert had a way of looking at art that was both analytical and emotional, seeing technique and feeling simultaneously, and Eleanor found herself sharing observations she'd never voiced before, thoughts about beauty and meaning that had seemed too personal to speak aloud, but that Robert received with understanding that felt almost intimate. When the museum announced its closing, Eleanor was startled to realize they'd been talking for 3 hours. That Tuesday afternoon had become Tuesday evening, that rain had intensified outside, while inside she'd been so absorbed in conversation she'd lost track of time entirely. Robert suggested coffee, his tone casual, but his eyes hopeful in ways that made Eleanor's heart do something complicated in her chest. Nervousness and anticipation tangled together in a way she hadn't felt in decades. The coffee shop near the museum was warm and crowded, full of students with laptops and couples on dates. And Eleanor and Robert claimed a corner table that felt private despite the surrounding bustle. Coffee turned into dinner at a quiet restaurant Robert knew, and dinner turned into hours more of conversation that ranged from art to architecture to books to travel to the particular challenges of being widowed in your 60s when everyone assumed you were fine because enough time had passed, when really, you were just better at performing fine while still feeling fundamentally incomplete. Eleanor learned that Robert had been married for 45 years, that he'd loved his wife Helen with devotion that was visible even in how he spoke about her, that her death had left him feeling like he'd lost not just his partner but his purpose, that retirement and widowhood had arrived simultaneously and left him unmoored in ways he was still trying to navigate. She told him about Richard, about the guilt she felt for grief that was real but not consuming, about wondering if she'd missed something essential in her marriage because she'd never felt the kind of devastating loss that other widows described. But mostly they talked about now rather than then, about who they were at 67 and 70, rather than who they'd been at 20 or 40, about the strange freedom that came with age and loss, the way caring less about others' opinions created space to care more about your own desires, the way proximity to mortality made you less willing to waste time on things that didn't matter, the way losing someone taught you that love's opposite wasn't hate but regret for things unsaid, unexperienced, postponed until someday that never came. When Robert walked Eleanor to her car in the museum parking garage, rain had stopped, and Portland's night air smelled clean and cold, autumn giving way to winter's approach. They stood by her car, making the kind of small talk that precedes goodbye, both seeming reluctant to end the evening, both aware something had shifted between them over these hours together, something that felt simultaneously comfortable and charged, familiar and entirely new. Robert asked if he could see her again, and the way he asked, direct but vulnerable, hopeful but prepared for rejection, made Eleanor understand that this mattered to him, that she mattered to him, that whatever connection they'd discovered in that museum gallery was something he wanted to explore further. She said yes, before overthinking could intervene, before reasonable caution could suggest slowing down, before the voice in her head that sounded like her practical daughter could point out all the sensible reasons to be careful about men met in museums. They exchanged phone numbers, and Robert kissed her cheek in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and somehow perfect, his lips warm against her cold skin, the brief contact sending something electric through her nervous system that Eleanor hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten bodies could respond this way to simple touch. And when she drove home through Portland's rain-slicked streets, her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman who looked different than she had that morning, more alive, more present, more aware of herself as someone who could still feel anticipation, who could still experience the particular flutter that came with looking forward to seeing someone again. Her daughter Rachel called that evening as Eleanor was getting ready for bed, their usual Tuesday night check-in, and Eleanor found herself mentioning meeting someone at the museum, keeping her tone casual, though her pulse quickened just talking about it. Rachel's response was enthusiastic but cautious, happiness that her mother was making friends, but underlying concern about men who approached women in museums, about being careful, about not rushing into anything, all the protective worry that came with adult children who'd switched roles and become the cautious ones while parents became reckless. Eleanor assured her daughter she was being sensible, that it was just coffee and conversation, nothing to worry about. But lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, replaying the day's conversations, remembering the warmth in Robert's eyes when he looked at her, feeling her body's continued awareness hours after that brief cheek kiss, Eleanor knew she was lying. This wasn't just coffee. This wasn't just friendly conversation between two lonely people. This was something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. Something that made her feel simultaneously too old and exactly the right age for whatever came next. She'd believed that part of her life was over. That romantic love was something that belonged to youth, or at least to the version of herself who'd been married and settled and building a family. She'd thought widowhood at 64 meant accepting loneliness as her new normal, meant focusing on grandchildren and hobbies and friendships rather than partnership or passion. She'd convinced herself she was content with solitude, that museums on Tuesday afternoons were fulfilling precisely because they were solitary, that needing no one was a form of strength rather than resignation. But meeting Robert had cracked something open inside her, had reminded her that contentment and happiness weren't the same thing, that accepting loneliness wasn't the same as choosing it, that there was a difference between being fine alone and actually wanting to be alone. And the wanting to see him again, wanting to talk more, wanting to explore this connection that had sparked so quickly between them, felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of something that could be wonderful or devastating, depending on courage and luck and timing. The question that kept Eleanor awake that night, the question that would come to define everything that followed, was whether 67 was too late to feel this way, whether starting something new at an age when most people were settling into retirement and routines made sense, or was simply foolish, whether meeting Robert was terrible timing or perfect timing, too late or exactly right, a mistake waiting to happen, or the thing she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Portland's autumn rain returned around midnight, steady percussion against bedroom windows, and Eleanor lay there listening to it, thinking about Robert, about the way he'd looked at the painting and then at her, about how conversation with him had felt like coming home to a place she'd never been, about the particular ache that came with discovering you could still want something desperately at an age when you'd thought wanting was behind you. And somewhere across the city, though Eleanor didn't know it yet, Robert lay awake too, thinking about the woman he'd met in a museum gallery, wondering if 67 was too young to believe in love at first sight, or if maybe, just maybe, some things were worth believing in regardless of age or logic or all the sensible reasons to be careful with hearts that had already been broken once. The second date happened 3 days after the first, though calling them dates felt inadequate for what they actually were. Extended conversations that happened to include activities like dinner or walking through Portland's Japanese garden, or sitting in Robert's living room drinking wine, while rain created a backdrop of white noise that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, reduced to just the two of them, and whatever was building between them with speed, that should have been alarming, but felt inevitable instead. Eleanor had promised herself she'd be sensible, would take things slowly, would protect herself from potential hurt by maintaining emotional distance and not investing too heavily too quickly. But promises made to yourself at 67, when you'd already lived most of your life and understood how quickly everything could end, carried less weight than promises made at 30. At 30, you had time to be careful. At 67, careful felt like another word for wasteful, for squandering whatever time remained by being too cautious to actually live. Robert called her every morning just after 8, his voice becoming the sound that marked the beginning of her day. They'd talk for an hour sometimes, about nothing important, what they'd had for breakfast, what they were planning to do, observations about weather or news, or the small details of daily life that became interesting when shared with someone who actually cared about hearing them. But underneath the mundane topics lived something else, an awareness of each other that made even boring conversations feel charged with possibility, with the unspoken question of what they were becoming to each other and how fast they were willing to let it happen. Their third date was the one that changed everything, though Eleanor only recognized it as pivotal in retrospect. Robert had invited her to his apartment, a beautiful space in Portland's Pearl District, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furnished with the kind of thoughtful elegance that suggested someone who cared about aesthetics, who understood that environments shaped experience. He cooked dinner for her, pasta with homemade sauce, salad with ingredients from the farmer's market, bread he'd baked himself, because retirement had given him time to learn things he'd always wanted to try. They ate at his dining table with candles and wine, and the intimacy of being in his home, of eating food he'd prepared, of seeing the life he'd built in the months since moving to Portland, created a shift in their connection. This wasn't public anymore. wasn't the safe neutrality of restaurants or museums. This was private, personal, the kind of setting that came with implications about what might happen next, about whether this evening would end with just dinner or with something more. Eleanor was nervous in ways she hadn't been since she was young, hyper-aware of her body and his proximity, of the way he looked at her across the table with appreciation that felt both respectful and hungry, of how her own desire was responding to his attention in ways that made her feel simultaneously alive and vulnerable. She'd been with one man for 42 years, had thought that part of her life was finished, that sexual desire was something that faded with age and widowhood. But sitting across from Robert, watching his hands as he gestured while talking, imagining those hands touching her, she understood her body had just been dormant, not dead, waiting for the right person to wake it up again. After dinner, they moved to his living room, sitting on his couch with more wine, and the conversation turned more personal, more vulnerable. Robert told her about Helen's final months, about holding her hand while she died, about the particular devastation of loving someone through their deterioration, watching them become less themselves until death felt almost like mercy. Eleanor told him about finding Richard dead, about the shock and guilt and strange relief that he'd gone quickly, that he hadn't suffered, that his last moments had been peaceful sleep rather than pain or fear or awareness of dying. But they also talked about now, about the strangeness of being attracted to someone new after decades of monogamy, about feeling simultaneously too old for this and exactly the right age, about whether starting something at 67 made sense or was simply postponing inevitable loneliness. Robert reached for Eleanor's hand while they talked, his fingers threading through hers with the kind of natural ease that suggested bodies knew what minds were still questioning. And the simple touch sent electricity through Eleanor's entire system, made her understand that chemistry didn't have an expiration date. That desire could be just as powerful at 67 as it had been at 27. Maybe more powerful, because now she understood how rare it was. When Robert kissed her, really kissed her, not the polite cheek kiss of their first goodbye, but a proper kiss, his mouth on hers, his hand cupping her face. Eleanor felt something unlock inside her that had been closed since Richard's death, maybe longer, maybe since before Richard had even died. This was different from anything she'd experienced in her marriage, more urgent, more consuming, the kind of kiss that made everything else disappear, that made her body remember it was capable of wanting this intensely, of responding this completely. They made love that night in Robert's bedroom, and it was nothing like Eleanor had imagined sex at 67 would be, not awkward or mechanical or diminished by age, but somehow more intimate, more meaningful than physical intimacy had ever been in her youth. There was vulnerability in undressing in front of someone new, in showing a body marked by decades and gravity and the inevitable changes that time created. But Robert looked at her like she was beautiful, touched her like she was precious, made her feel desired in ways that had nothing to do with youth or perfection and everything to do with connection, with seeing each other completely and choosing each other anyway. Afterward, lying in his bed with Portland city lights creating patterns on the ceiling, Eleanor experienced something close to panic. This was real now, not just attraction or possibility, but actual physical intimacy that came with emotional implications she wasn't sure she was ready for. She'd convinced herself she was too old for this kind of intensity, that her life was settled, that contentment was enough. But lying in Robert's arms, feeling his heart beating against her back, understanding that what they'd just shared had changed everything, she realized contentment had never been enough. She'd just been too scared to admit she wanted more. Robert seemed to sense her anxiety, pulling her closer, telling her quietly that they didn't have to define this, didn't have to make decisions about the future tonight, could just be present in this moment and see where it led. His words were meant to comfort, but they created their own terror. The acknowledgement that this was undefined, that at their age, relationships came with complications like adult children and established lives and health concerns, and the constant awareness that time was finite. that whatever they built together had an expiration date that was closer than either wanted to acknowledge. Eleanor stayed that night, waking in Robert's bed as dawn turned Portland's sky from black to gray to the pale blue of November morning. She watched him sleep, his face peaceful in ways it never was when awake, his breathing deep and steady, and she understood something fundamental. Meeting Robert wasn't too late or too early. It was exactly on time. The universe's way of showing her that life wasn't over just because she'd lived most of it. That love wasn't something reserved for youth, but was available at any age if you were brave enough to reach for it, if you were willing to risk heartbreak for the chance at connection. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things entirely. Eleanor was terrified of getting hurt, of Robert getting hurt, of building something beautiful only to lose it to age or illness, or any of the 100 ways people lost each other at 67. She was terrified of her children's judgment, of friends who might think she was moving too fast, of her own capacity to survive another loss after she'd barely survived the last one. But more than fear, she felt alive, present, aware of herself as someone who could still want and be wanted, who could still experience the particular joy that came with new love, with discovering someone who made the world feel more vivid, more meaningful, more worth being present in. Robert woke to find her watching him, pulled her close, kissed her with morning breath and sleep-warm skin, and the kind of casual intimacy that suggested this could become routine, that mornings like this could be their new normal if they were brave enough to claim it. And lying there in his arms, feeling safe and terrified simultaneously, Eleanor made a choice. She chose this, chose him, chose the risk of heartbreak over the safety of loneliness, chose to believe that meeting at 67 wasn't too late, but was instead exactly the right time, when they were old enough to understand what they had and brave enough to fight for it regardless of how much time remained to fight with. The honeymoon phase, if you could call it that at 67 and 70, lasted exactly 3 weeks before reality inserted itself in the form of Eleanor's daughter Rachel, showing up unannounced at her mother's house on a Saturday morning and finding Robert's car in the driveway, Robert himself in the kitchen making breakfast, and Eleanor wearing his shirt over her pajamas, with the kind of comfortable intimacy that made clear this wasn't the first time they'd spent the night together. Rachel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, concern, and something that looked uncomfortably like judgment. And Eleanor felt herself reverting to childhood, wanting to justify herself, to explain, to apologize for behavior that shouldn't require apology, but that her daughter's expression suggested did. Robert, to his credit, handled the awkwardness with grace, introducing himself, offering coffee, giving Eleanor and Rachel space to talk, while he tactfully retreated to the living room with a newspaper he didn't read. But that provided cover for what was clearly going to be a difficult conversation. Rachel's concerns were practical, wrapped in emotional. Was Eleanor sure she knew what she was doing? Had she considered the complications of starting a new relationship at her age? What about Robert's intentions? What about health issues? What about the fact that she'd only known him 3 weeks and was already sleeping with him? What about protecting herself financially and emotionally? What about not rushing into something she might regret? The subtext underneath all the practical concerns was simpler and more primal. Fear of losing her mother. Fear of someone taking advantage. Fear of change to family dynamics that had finally stabilized after Richard's death. Eleanor listened to her daughter's litany of worries with patience she had to work to maintain, understanding that Rachel's concern came from love, but also recognizing that adult children sometimes forgot their parents were still people with needs and desires that didn't disappear just because they'd reached a certain age. She told Rachel gently but firmly that she was a grown woman who'd been making her own decisions for nearly 70 years, that she appreciated the concern, but didn't require permission or approval, that Robert made her happy in ways she hadn't been happy in longer than she cared to admit, and that life at 67 was too short to waste time being careful when she could be experiencing joy instead. The conversation ended without full resolution. Rachel leaving with visible reluctance and lingering concern. And Eleanor returned to the kitchen where Robert was actually reading the newspaper now, giving her privacy, but clearly having heard enough through thin walls to understand the situation. He asked if she was okay, if Rachel's concerns made her want to slow down, if protecting her relationship with her daughter meant reconsidering their relationship with each other. And Eleanor surprised herself by being absolutely certain in her answer. No, she didn't want to slow down, didn't want to reconsider, didn't want to let anyone else's fear dictate her choices about her own life. But Rachel's visit had planted seeds of doubt that grew over the following days, making Eleanor hyper-aware of all the practical complications she'd been ignoring in favor of feeling. They lived in different apartments, had different routines, different friend groups, different relationships with their adult children who were at various stages of acceptance or resistance to their parents' new relationship. Robert's daughter Emma was cautiously supportive, seemingly happy that her father had found companionship after years of loneliness. But his son Michael was more skeptical, concerned about protecting his father from potential heartbreak or financial complications, or all the risks that came with vulnerability at 70. And there were health concerns that couldn't be ignored at their age. Robert took medication for high blood pressure and cholesterol. Eleanor had arthritis that made some days more painful than others. Both carried the awareness that bodies at 70 didn't come with guarantees about tomorrow, that starting something new meant accepting the possibility of loss, not in some distant future, but in the very immediate present. They had frank conversations about mortality and illness, and the likelihood that one of them would end up caring for the other through decline, about whether it was fair to ask that of someone you'd known for weeks rather than decades, about whether love at 70 was selfish or simply human. But despite the complications and concerns and very real obstacles, what Eleanor and Robert had together continued to deepen in ways that felt both miraculous and terrifying. They spent nearly every day together, dividing time between his apartment and her house, learning each other's habits and quirks and the particular rhythms of lives lived for 7 decades before meeting. Robert was methodical and organized in ways that sometimes frustrated Eleanor's more spontaneous nature. Eleanor was prone to anxiety spirals that Robert learned to interrupt with gentle humor and physical grounding, a hand on her back, arms around her shoulders, presence that reminded her she wasn't alone in whatever she was worrying about. They traveled together for the first time in December, a long weekend in the Oregon coast town of Cannon Beach, staying in a small inn with ocean views and spending days walking the beach regardless of weather, talking endlessly about everything and nothing, making love in the afternoons when rain made staying indoors feel like luxury rather than limitation. The trip created intimacy that went beyond physical, the vulnerability of traveling together, of seeing each other in different contexts, of navigating small annoyances and compromises that came with any relationship, but that felt more significant when you were building something new at an age when most people had already established all their patterns. Eleanor found herself thinking about the future in ways she'd stopped doing after Richard died, imagining not just next week or next month, but actual years stretching ahead, wondering what it would look like to build a life with Robert, rather than just enjoy a relationship with him. They hadn't discussed living together or marriage or any of the formal commitments that might make sense, both seemingly cautious about moving too fast, despite having already moved quite fast in emotional and physical terms. But the question hung unspoken between them. What were they building, and where did they see it going? The answer came unexpectedly on New Year's Eve, which they spent quietly at Robert's apartment, just the two of them with good wine and homemade dinner, and the kind of comfortable intimacy that had developed over their months together. As midnight approached, and Portland's fireworks began creating bursts of color against dark sky, Robert took Eleanor's hands and told her something that made her breath catch in her throat. He told her he was in love with her, truly in love in ways he'd only been once before with Helen, that meeting her had felt like being given a second chance at something he'd thought was finished, that every day with her felt like gift he didn't deserve but was grateful for anyway. He told her he wanted more than just dating or companionship. He wanted to build an actual life together, wanted her to move in with him, or him to move in with her, or them to find someplace new that belonged to both of them. wanted to stop pretending they were taking things slow, when the truth was they'd both jumped in completely and were just too scared to admit it. Eleanor's response was complicated by tears and laughter and overwhelming emotion that made coherent speech difficult, but the essence of what she told him was simple. Yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to love and life together and taking the risk of building something when they had no guarantees about how long they'd have to build with. Yes to choosing joy over caution, presence over protection, love over fear. Yes to believing that meeting at 67 wasn't too late, but was instead exactly the right time, when they were old enough to know what mattered and brave enough to reach for it regardless of obstacles or opinions, or the very real possibility that time would be crueler to them than they deserved. They kissed at midnight with Portland, celebrating around them. Two people who'd found each other late but not too late, who discovered that love didn't have an age limit or an expiration date, that hearts could break and heal and break again, and somehow still be capable of feeling everything. Desire and devotion and the particular terror that came with caring deeply about someone when you understood exactly how fragile everything was. And standing there in Robert's arms with fireworks illuminating the sky and the new year beginning, Eleanor understood something she'd been avoiding since that first day in the museum. This was it. This was the love people spent lifetimes searching for. The connection most people never found regardless of how much time they had to look. And finding it at 67, when she'd thought that part of life was over, when she'd resigned herself to comfortable solitude, felt less like tragedy of timing and more like perfect synchronicity, meeting Robert exactly when they were both ready, when they'd both lived enough to understand what they had, when they'd both loved and lost enough to appreciate the miracle of being given another chance to feel this alive, this present, this overwhelmingly, terrifyingly in love. Eleanor moved into Robert's apartment in February, on a gray Portland morning when rain fell steady and cold, and the practical task of combining 2 lifetimes' worth of possessions felt both monumental and strangely simple. She kept her house for now, renting it to a young couple her realtor daughter had screened thoroughly, maintaining the safety net of having somewhere to return to if this grand experiment in late-life love collapsed. But even as she signed the rental agreement, Eleanor knew she was keeping the house more for her children's peace of mind than her own. She had no intention of needing it, no belief that what she and Robert were building would fail. The combining of lives at 67 and 70 required different negotiations than combining lives at 27 and 30. They both came with fully formed preferences about everything from how to load the dishwasher to what temperature to keep the thermostat, from morning routines that had been established for decades to friendships and commitments that predated their relationship. But they navigated the complications with patience born from experience, understanding that compromise wasn't about winning or losing, but about creating something new that honored both their histories while building toward a shared future. Robert's children came to dinner that first week, a gathering that felt uncomfortably like audition or inspection. Emma and Michael evaluating Eleanor with the protective scrutiny of people who'd watched their father grieve for 4 years and were understandably cautious about his happiness being dependent on someone they barely knew. Eleanor cooked, her grandmother's lasagna recipe that had never failed to win people over, and answered questions with honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable, but that felt necessary for building trust. Yes, she loved their father. Yes, she understood the risks of starting something at their age. No, she had no interest in his money or inheritance. Yes, she was willing to sign whatever prenuptial agreements would make everyone comfortable. And most importantly, yes, she would take care of him if he got sick, the way she hoped he would take care of her, the way people who loved each other were supposed to take care of each other regardless of how long they'd known each other. The dinner ended with cautious acceptance, if not quite enthusiasm. Emma hugging Eleanor goodbye with genuine warmth, Michael shaking her hand with less hostility than he'd shown at the beginning of the evening. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, acknowledgement that their father's happiness mattered, even if his choices made them uncomfortable, that love at 70 deserved support, rather than skepticism. Eleanor's children remained more complicated. Rachel struggled with seeing her mother as someone with desires and needs beyond being a grandmother and retired teacher, and her son James, lived across the country, and had responded to news of the relationship with polite distance that suggested he'd rather not think too hard about his mother's romantic life. But gradually, as months passed and Eleanor's happiness became undeniable, even Rachel began to soften, to see Robert not as threat, but as gift, as the person who'd brought her mother back to life in ways Rachel hadn't realized she'd gone dormant. Spring came to Portland with cherry blossoms and warming temperatures, and Eleanor and Robert fell into rhythms that felt both established and constantly renewing. They walked every morning through their Pearl District neighborhood, rain or shine, conversations ranging from mundane planning to philosophical depth. They cooked together most evenings, developed favorite restaurants for nights they didn't feel like cooking, hosted dinners for blended groups of friends who initially came together awkwardly, but gradually formed their own connections. They traveled, short trips to wine country and the coast, a longer journey to California to visit Robert's son, plans forming for more ambitious travel when summer arrived. But more than activities or routines, what defined their life together was the continued intensity of their connection, physical and emotional intimacy that didn't fade with familiarity but seemed to deepen with time. They made love frequently, Eleanor's initial self-consciousness about her aging body having given way to confidence born from Robert's consistent appreciation, from understanding that desire at 67 was about connection rather than perfection, about seeing each other completely, and choosing each other anyway. Their physical relationship was passionate in ways that surprised Eleanor, who'd internalized messages about sexuality fading with age, who'd thought desire was something that belonged to youth, rather than something that could intensify with maturity. Robert proposed in May, not with grand gesture, but with quiet certainty on an ordinary Tuesday evening, as they sat on his balcony, watching sunset paint Portland's sky in shades of amber and rose. He told her he wanted to marry her, not because they needed legal documentation of what they already had, but because he wanted to stand in front of everyone they loved and claim her publicly, permanently, without reservation or hedging about the future's uncertainty. He wanted to call her his wife, wanted her to call him her husband, wanted the formal commitment that said they were building something meant to last whatever time they had left. Eleanor said yes, through tears and laughter, accepting the simple platinum band Robert offered with hands that shook with emotion. Joy and fear tangled together, awareness that marriage at 67 came with different implications than marriage at 27, that they were promising to love each other until death do us part, when death was a much closer possibility than it had been in youth. But the awareness of mortality made the commitment more meaningful rather than less, made every day together feel precious, made the ordinary moments of life, morning coffee, evening walks, nights spent reading side by side, feel like the real romance, the actual love story, more meaningful than grand gestures or expensive dates. They married in July in Robert's daughter's garden, a small ceremony with just their children and grandchildren and closest friends. Eleanor wearing a simple blue dress rather than white, because white felt dishonest for a second marriage in your 60s, and Robert in a suit that made him look distinguished and handsome and exactly like the man she'd fallen in love with in that museum gallery 9 months ago. Their vows were traditional, but felt radical when spoken at 70 and 67, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for as long as they both lived. Because at their age, as long as we both shall live, wasn't abstract future but very immediate present, wasn't something to take for granted, but something to fight for, to be grateful for every day they got to honor those promises. The reception was joyful and emotional. Speeches from children who'd gone from skeptical to supportive, from friends who'd watched both Eleanor and Robert grieve their first spouses and were moved by their courage to love again. From Emma, who told a story about her father's face the first time he'd mentioned meeting someone at the museum, the particular light that had come into his eyes, the way he'd sounded younger somehow, more alive, more present. And Rachel, in her speech, admitted she'd been wrong to worry, that watching her mother with Robert had taught her something about love and aging and the importance of choosing joy over safety, presence over protection. Eleanor and Robert's first dance was to a jazz standard from their youth, and holding her new husband, swaying to music in a garden filled with people they loved. Eleanor understood with absolute clarity the answer to the question that had haunted her since that first museum encounter. They hadn't met too late. They'd met exactly when they needed to, when they were old enough to understand what they had, experienced enough to know how to protect it, brave enough to claim it despite every practical reason to be cautious. Meeting at 67 meant they'd already lived most of their lives. Yes, but it also meant they understood what mattered, had learned through loss and grief and decades of experience to distinguish between what was essential and what was just noise. Meeting at 67 meant they didn't waste time on petty arguments or meaningless conflicts, didn't postpone joy for someday that might not come, didn't take each other for granted, because they'd both experienced the devastation of losing someone and refused to squander whatever time they'd been given together. Their wedding night was spent at a small coastal inn, the same place they'd stayed that December weekend, full circle from beginning of their relationship to this new beginning as husband and wife. They made love with the windows open to ocean sounds, with the same passion that had characterized their relationship from the start, but also with the added depth that 9 months of knowing each other had created, the trust and comfort and absolute certainty that this was right, that they were right, that love at 67 was just as valid and vital and consuming as love at any other age. Lying in bed afterward with Robert's arms around her and ocean breeze cooling their heated skin, Eleanor thought about timing and fate, and the particular grace of being given a second chance when you'd thought all chances were behind you. She thought about Richard with gratitude for their years together, but without the guilt that had initially accompanied thoughts of him. Understanding now that loving Robert didn't diminish what she'd had with Richard, that hearts were capable of multiple loves across a lifetime, that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the present. And she thought about that Tuesday afternoon in the museum, about how close she'd come to not going, about how different her life would be if she'd chosen to stay home instead. If Robert had visited the museum on Wednesday instead of Tuesday, if any of the tiny circumstances that had aligned to bring them together had shifted even slightly. The randomness of it should have been terrifying, so much depending on chance, on coincidence, on being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. But instead it felt like gift, like grace, like evidence that even at 67, life was still capable of surprising you, still able to offer joy you'd stopped expecting, still willing to give you exactly what you needed exactly when you needed it. Robert stirred beside her, pulling her closer, kissing her shoulder with sleepy affection. And Eleanor felt something settle inside her that had been restless since Richard's death, maybe longer. She felt complete. Not because Robert completed her, she'd been whole on her own, but because sharing life with him made everything more vivid, more meaningful, more worth being fully present for. She felt grateful, not just for finding him, but for being brave enough to reach for what she wanted when every practical consideration suggested caution, for choosing possibility over safety, for believing that love at 67 deserved the same commitment and passion as love at any age. The question that had defined their story, too late or just in time, had only ever had one answer. Just in time. Exactly on time. The perfect time. Because love didn't operate on schedules or timelines, didn't care about age or practical concerns, or all the sensible reasons to be careful. Love showed up when it showed up, demanded to be felt fully or not at all, required courage and vulnerability and willingness to risk heartbreak for the chance at connection. And meeting Robert at 67, when Eleanor had thought that part of life was over, when she'd resigned herself to comfortable solitude, had been the universe's way of reminding her that it's never too late to feel everything, to want everything, to reach for everything, to believe that the best parts of life might still be ahead rather than behind. They had time, maybe years, maybe decades, maybe just moments. But whatever time they had would be spent together, fully present, completely alive, grateful for every ordinary day and every extraordinary feeling, understanding that this was the gift of late love. You didn't take it for granted because you understood exactly how precious and fragile and miraculous it was to find someone who made you feel this way. To build something beautiful when you'd thought all building was behind you. To discover that hearts that had been broken could not only heal, but could love again. Possibly even better than they'd loved before. With all the wisdom and courage that came from having lived long enough to know what really mattered. Just in time. Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms with those words repeating like prayer, like gratitude, like the truest thing she'd ever known. Did Eleanor and Robert's story touch something deep within you? This beautiful journey reminds us that love doesn't consult calendars or care about age. It simply arrives when it arrives, demanding to be felt fully regardless of how many years we've already lived. That meeting someone at 67 isn't too late, but might actually be exactly the right time, when we're finally wise enough to recognize what matters and brave enough to reach for it. If this story stirred hope in you, a belief that it's never too late to feel everything and to want everything, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs this reminder. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about love that defies expectations and proves that the best chapters of our lives might still be unwritten. Thank you for being part of this community.